All right, here we are. We're back. Uh, don't get too comfortable. But the Friday morning, Jesus is arrested. The plot is to have him drag him before the Jewish authorities for a hearing at which they will try to establish that he is a pretender king, that he's a seditionist, and then they're going to take him to Pilate. And the plan is that he will rather perfunctorily, that is just sort of rubber stamp, and Jesus will be hauled off to be crucified before the city wakes up. Now, as I said to you as we were closing, there are a number of embarrassing protocols, in a number of embarrassing ways, protocols that were dear and absolutely basic to Jewish criminal trials and so on were violated. One of the most important is that you can't have a trial between sundown and sunup because you can't get witnesses. And in fact, they were having a trial in a private home. I'll tell you another protocol was that if it was a capital offense, that is, if it was an accusation where if he was found guilty, he would be executed. If two witnesses ever contradicted each other, immediately the case was thrown out and the man was released. So all of this becomes important. But the point is that they can't have a trial between sundown and sunup, but they are doing that. And he brought, first of all, to Annas, and Annas tries to get him. They're trying to come up with something they can use against him. And Jesus won't have it. And so finally, not finally at all, but after that brief interview, which is, again, I'm going to say only recorded by John. But remember that John says, let me take you there, John says that they led him away to Annas first. John knows that you've got the synoptics. And in each of the synoptics, Jesus is taken to Caiaphas. And John says that he is going to be taken to Caiaphas, but nonetheless, he says he took him to Annas first. All right, so the first stage of the Jewish hearing is that brief interview by Annas where he tries to get Jesus to confess something concerning himself, and Jesus keeps saying, just live by the protocols of your own culture. All right, then, the second stage is what you think of. All right, now very quickly, Matthew and Mark focus on this stage of the trial. And it's in the middle of the night, and what they're doing is just trying to come up with credible testimony that Jesus is a pretender king. That's everything that's going on here. And they keep bringing witnesses. And because of what I mentioned before, that Jesus was so circumspect, so wise as a serpent, that he hadn't used the word Christ of himself, all the people that were brought, they disagreed. They couldn't find anybody who could give credible testimony that Jesus had referred to himself as a king, because Jesus had not in that term. Well, and again, you have to understand that the Sanhedrinists, the Jewish leadership here on early Friday morning, know that they're working against the clock, because this has got to happen before the city wakes up, and he's got to be taken to Pilate. And they have an appointment with Pilate. Pilate is going to convene his judiciary and so on for this, but first of all, they got to be able to have something they can use to charge against him. So this is the way that Matthew tells the story. He says, the chief priests, the elders, and all the council, that's the Sanhedrin, sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none, but at last two false witnesses came forward and appealed to this. He said, I'm going to destroy the temple, but it didn't go anywhere. And so finally, here's where I want to go. I found it. Now, the high priest, who's the high priest? Again, this is Caiaphas. He arose and he said, oh, by the way, during this entire time, Jesus never speaks. With all of the calumny, with all the accusations being hurled at him and so on, Jesus, as a lamb before the slaughter, is dumb. He never speaks. And Caiaphas is amazed. He doesn't try and defend himself. So he says this, Caiaphas, and this is a key issue right here. He says, do you answer nothing? What is it that these men testify? But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, now watch this, I put you under oath by the living God. Now, that is entirely tantamount to a judge or a bailiff or whatever. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth? He is being put under legal oath. Now listen, another protocol of Jewish jurisprudence. And again, I got to say, this is born right out of what the Old Testament teaches. And one of those protocols is that you never interrogate the witness. This is why America has a Fifth Amendment. It arises entirely and deliberately out of the Old Testament command that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, you only convict a man on the basis of eyewitness testimony. And that excludes the interrogating the accused, because you can beat him to death and get anything you need out of him. So the Jewish protocol was you never interrogate the accused. That's exactly what Caiaphas is doing. But he's frustrated. The clock is ticking. He knows he's got an appointment with Pilate. None of these false witnesses are going anywhere. So finally he says, and here it is, he says, I put you under oath by the living God. So he swears Jesus in, if you don't mind, as a witness, illegal. And he says, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. So again, here you have the 70 Sanhedrinists or so, and Caiaphas is finally frustrated, puts Jesus under oath, tell us. Are you the Christ, the Son? Now, that's exactly what Jesus had been claiming. He'd been doing it carefully. I think that Caiaphas was totally clutching at straws. I don't think he had any real confidence that Jesus was going to confess to this. But to his delight and amazement, Jesus said, it is as you said. All right, time out real quickly. Know this, folks, that this conversation is doubtless being carried out in Aramaic. Aramaic or Babylonish, are you familiar with this? When they came home from Babylon, when they came back from Babylon, the Jews, they had fairly lost the Hebrew tongue. And their mother tongue was Aramaic, all right? On the other hand, Matthew is writing this down in Greek. And it's interesting that in Mark, which is Peter's telling, in this same scene, well, here, I have the access, I should do it. When Jesus is asked this exact same question, his reply is, here it is. Now remember, do you remember that in Matthew he says, it is as you said. In Mark, it's the same thing, but he says right here, the high priest asked him, saying, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus says, I am. So some people have said, and hear this, it's going to come up a number of times in the Gospels. Aramaic has no word for yes. It has a number of expressions. The strongest of those expressions, that is, the strongest way to give an affirmative answer to a question is to say, it's exactly as you said. My dad used to, he was, it was warm today. Oh, you said it. You get that all the time. And it's really what he's saying. He's saying, you said. Now, watch this. In Matthew, Caiaphas says, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? And Jesus says, it is as you said. In Mark, Caiaphas has the same question. He says, I am. This is one of the points where critics will say, see, and they'll read Matthew this way, where Jesus said, it is as you said. They'll read it to say, well, you said that. I didn't say that. I don't know where you got that. That's not what it means. You know what it means? I am. Or to say it another way, he is affirming. Now, Mark, who's writing for a more Roman audience, gives it to us in the meaning as opposed to the specific colloquial expression, I am. All right, does that make sense to you? It's more important than you might realize. But let's park that for a minute. Come back to it. Let's go to the drama. What's at stake is that the Sanhedrinists desperately need a testimony to convince Pilate that Jesus is a pretender king. They can't find it. And so Caiaphas, out of desperation, says, you tell us, are you the Christ? And his delight, Jesus says, I am. Well, at that point, the whole saying, we got him. We got him. He just said in the hearing of all of these witnesses that he is a king. And if he's a king, he's a threat to Rome, and now we can take him to Pilate. Does that make sense to you? So that's really the drama of this second stage of the this second stage of the Jewish hearing. All right, now I got to be quick. By the way, I mentioned here on the on the overhead, and this is in your notes, that it's fascinating, folks, how much ink is given in all four Gospels to Peter's unhappy role in this drama, and the fact that he had made his way into the high priestly courtyard, and that remember that I never mentioned this, but I think you're familiar with it. But in the upper room last night, Thursday during the Passover feast, or after the Passover feast, Jesus, when he announced that the betrayer was at the table, Peter had said, "If all others go back, I'll never go back." And Jesus had said, no, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows, before the sun comes up. So Peter is in the courtyard. Now, here's what's going to happen. Jesus, all right, it's the middle of the night. The Sanhedrinists have got what they came for. They have credible testimony from the lips of Jesus himself that he is a king, a pretender king by their notion, and therefore they can take him to Pilate. But it's still the middle of the night. And Pilate is not happy about this. He's not just playing along. They know it. And so I think they are fearful that Pilate may throw the whole thing out of court just because they did it in the middle of the night. And so what they're going to do, now hear this, what they're going to do is wait until the first blush of dawn. And I don't mean where the sky begins to get pink. I mean to where there's the first blush of gray on the horizon and the sunlight, because the protocol is, the law is, you can't have a trial between sundown and sunup. So they're going to wait until the first blush of dawn, and then they're going to haul Jesus back in, and they're going to get him to say it again so that they can go to Pilate and say, according to our own protocols, it was after sunup, he confessed he is the Christ. So they take Jesus. Now you got a picture. This is a huge villa. It is built around undoubtedly at least one, maybe more courtyards. And in those courtyards are various facilities and so on, installations. And so Jesus is hauled out of the main room and across the courtyard to some sort of cistern or wine cellar or someplace where he can be held. All they're doing is waiting for the first blush of dawn. Got that? Meanwhile, Peter is in the courtyard, and he has already twice insisted that he's not a follower of Jesus, and now he's warming his hands. You know this story, and somebody comes, says, "I can tell by your accent, you're Galilean, I think you're one of them." And at that moment, Peter, for the third time, denies that he is a follower of Christ, and as the words are spilling out of his mouth, the rooster crows. Now, are you with me? What are the Sanhedrin, what are they waiting for? The first blush of dawn, right? When does the rooster crow? At the first blush of dawn. And so that's why so now the Sanhedrinists are going to regather and get Jesus to confess this again. The soldiers go out and they take Jesus and they're hauling him across that same courtyard to bring him in for this immediately post-dawn hearing. Peter is warming his hands and he denies the Lord a third time, and the rooster crows, and the Bible says that Jesus turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. And the question is always, well, why is Jesus right there? You see what's going on? They're hauling him back into the main room so they can have this trial. So, and Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. By the way, during the time that Jesus has been held in anticipation of this third stage of the Jewish hearing, if you don't mind, the Roman soldiers were making sport with him. And this is when they blindfold him and cuff him and say, if you're really a prophet, tell. So Jesus is already swollen and bruised and so on. Of course, he's manacled. But now he is dragged back across the courtyard, encounters Peter, hears Peter deny him the third time, looks upon him. Peter goes out. Now Jesus is brought back in, and you have the third stage of the Jewish trial. Now hear me, folks. This is only recorded by Luke. And this is where the main charge of incoherence and inconsistency comes, because the story told by Luke is not the same as the story by Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark are talking about that second stage, the extended stage. Luke is talking about the third stage, which is very brief. No witnesses, no protocols, just Jesus, tell us again. I'll come back to this. Does that make sense to you? Now, both, I'm not going to take you there, but both Matthew and Mark allude to this. After the main trial, they say that then Jesus, as the sun came up and very early, Jesus was once again interrogated. Oh, I better do it. Look, this is kind of a thing with me, forgive me, but there is so much made of this, and it's so, let me take you to the, I can do it here. Here is the passage in Luke where it says, as soon as it was day, that's what they're waiting for, the elders of the people, chief priests, came together and led him to their council, and they just said, if you are the Christ, tell us. Now, the point is, are you with me? This is not the same trial as was recorded in Matthew and Mark. But both Matthew and Mark allude to it. Let me take you there. Matthew 27, verse 1. Can you see that? When morning came, all the chief priests and so on plotted against Jesus to put him to death. So that is an allusion to the same thing. You have the same thing in Mark 15, where he briefly alludes to this stage of the trial. So, number one, the record can be trusted. That's what I'm telling you. And you spend some time with it, you discover that it fits together perfectly. Let me take you, on the other hand, to this third stage of the trial, because what happens is, that's not what I wanted to do. Here it is. As soon as it was day. This is Luke's telling. Now, I've confused you. I'm saying that Matthew and Mark tell us all about the second stage of the trial. Then they just make passing reference to the third stage. Luke goes straight to the third stage and tells us exactly what happened. And this is what happened. They said, they brought him to, this is after the sun has begun to rise, and they bring him in and they say, if you are the Christ, tell us. And it's interesting that Jesus refuses. He says, if I tell you, you'll by no means believe me, but I'll tell you this, you're going to see the Son of Man will sit in the right hand of the power of God. So, and then in the next verse it says, then they all said, okay, are you the Son of God? And again, Jesus said, you rightly say that I am. Now, what's going on is this, and this, can you sort this out, folks? It's really important. All right, I'll just ask you. Here are Jesus' two claims. I am the Christ. I am God, very God. Which of those is going to be most offensive to a Jewish audience? His claim to be God. I mean, they have false messiahs, but to claim to be God, that's what's offensive to the Jewish people. That's why they're going to put him to death. I'm going to show you in a minute, John 19:7. On the other hand, here are Jesus' two claims. I am the Christ, a king, the Son of the living God. Which of those is going to be, which of those do they want to use to get him dead? It's going to be Christ, right? That's what they're convinced they can use to convince Pilate that Jesus is additionist. So when Caiaphas in the middle of the night demanded to put Jesus under oath, and he said, tell us, this is exactly what he used Jesus' word. Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Jesus said, I am. We got him. Now they bring him back in. All they're trying to do is to set up this trial before Pilate. And so all they want to do is hear him say after sunup, so they can say they observe their protocols, that he is the Christ. So they simply say, if you are the Christ, tell us. You already did it a few minutes ago, but again, if you are the Christ, tell us. I'm not going to do that. And then they all kind of sigh, I think, and say, okay, are you the Son of God as well as the Christ? That's the point. Jesus said, you're exactly right. Jesus wants the record to be absolutely clear. What he claimed is to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. Of those two, the one that is political merchandise is his claim to be the Christ. That's what they want to hear him say so they can take him to Pilate. Jesus won't let the record be truncated. And so he insists that they include both elements. Now, having said it, and it says it right here in the scriptures, it goes on to say that the Sanhedrin has said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own mouth, so off to Pilate. Now, I am going to argue that this is about 4:30 in the morning. And the reason is because that's when the sun begins to rise. I've sat up and listened for the roosters in Israel. And at this season of the year, it's going to be about 4:30 in the morning. So Jesus is arrested about 11, 12 o'clock. He is brought to the high priestly villa, and you have the Annas thing with a little interview. Then you have the more extended trial that goes on for some time. They can't get witnesses. Caiaphas says, tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the living God? I am. Ha, we got him. Keep him in hold for a time. Now you're waiting for the first blush of dawn. Bring him back in. Once again, are you the Christ? I'm not going to confess that. Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Probably say, okay, I am. Now they're going to take him off to Pilate. They've been waiting for the first blush of just the first grayness on the horizon, and that's about 4:30 in the morning. By the way, now watch this. When Jesus is turned over to be crucified, when Pilate washes his hands and turns Jesus over, so now we've got the Jewish leadership bringing him to Pilate. And when Pilate, we're going to go through this, turns him over to be crucified, John 19:14 says it was about 6 in the morning, about the 6th hour. So all of the Roman trial has to fit between about 4:30 in the morning and about 6 o'clock. So we got about an hour and a half to work with. That make sense to you? All right, now in that regard, let me take you back to the PowerPoint, and now we come to the trial before the Roman authorities. And again, here is this map, and this map is in your notes for what it's worth, but when the Sanhedrin heard that Jesus confessed he was the Christ, they thought now that they could make the case to Pilate that this man is a seditionist and a threat to Rome. So now Jesus is taken to the Praetorium. Now watch, kids. I don't know how. This is important. Just because. But let me say that. All right, Pilate is the prefect. He lives on the Mediterranean at Caesarea Maritima. On the other hand, at feast season, he comes up to Jerusalem. Where is he going to stay? Well, suffice it to say, I'll be quick, and I give you it on the map here. But there are, for about a millennium, just under a millennium, since the Crusaders, the persuasion has been that Jesus was tried here at the Fortress Antonia. I've got it circled. And the argument is that this is where Pilate would have stayed when he was in town. It's wrong. On the other hand, there is another place, which I think is the right place, and you need to go here. Folks, I'm telling you, you're going to Jerusalem, you're going to Israel, some of you. This is terrible to say. The people who are guiding you won't know about this place, but you can find it. If you're staying in Jerusalem, you can find it. It's marvelous. I'll show you a picture of it. I think you can stand there and know you're at the spot where Jesus was tried before Pontius Pilate. It's amazing. But it is Herod's palace. Now, Herod's palace, this becomes important at this point, that Herod's palace, it's on the western hill. All right, here's what's important. We've only got an hour and a half to get this all in. If Jesus is being hauled from place to place, see, Caiaphas, I mentioned this to you before, Caiaphas' house was probably the most beautiful villa on the western hill, except for Herod's palace. And they're very close. And so Caiaphas, and it was in Caiaphas, it was in the high priestly villa that Jesus had been tried by the Jews. So now he's taken, I think, to a gate on the west side of Herod's palace. And here's a picture of it. Now, I'll tell you very quickly, I can get kind of lost in this, but this wall system right here is in fact the modern wall system. The walls that surround the old city of Jerusalem today are modern. They were built in 1540s. That's not real modern by our standards, but they are very modern. On the other hand, at this point, they follow perfectly the line of Herod's wall. And this wall was well covered with dirt. You can see it on the picture here. And in the late 70s, early 80s, they had an archaeological effort to pull all that dirt away. And when they did, they discovered this gate system. And if I go back to this, you can see that there is a gate on the western side, and it features, number one, a huge walkway, sort of a ceremonial walkway. Herod the Great had this built for purposes I won't go into. And it's all in the record, in Josephus, primarily. But anyway, you have this beautiful walkway, and then you have an actual bema seat. Well, you can see it up in the where the canopy is spread, and that's where Pilate would have sat. So just trust me, if you leave the Jaffa Gate, folks, and just stay right along the wall and walk to the south about maybe 10 minutes, you'll see on your left, and there's an actual placard there that describes it as what's called the Gate of the Essenes. And just know that that is where Jesus was tried before Pilate. But I'm going to leave it at that. There is the close-up of the gate. But, all right, now, let me walk you through this and let me say this to you. I told you before that I have rather unusual regard for the man Pilate. And I will say on the authority of none other than Jesus himself that Pilate is not a primary villain in this story. The primary villain is Caiaphas. But suffice it to say, Pilate was indeed the Roman officer. He was the prefect. He was that from 26 to 36. And therefore, it fell his lot to try the Nazarene because the Sanhedrinists were insisting that the Nazarene was a threat. Now, let me just walk you through, and then I want to go back to it after the break. Let me walk you through the Roman trial. There are 3 stages to the Roman trial. First of all, John 18, the Sanhedrinists bring Jesus, and again, the sun is it's not even up. The light is just beginning to dawn on the eastern horizon, but they bring, and of course, Pilate, it's 4:30 in the morning, he had to set his alarm pretty early. So, and they bring him to Pilate, and Pilate says, "What is the charge?" And the Jewish leadership, who know they got nothing to stand on, really say, "Look, if he weren't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Just crucify him." Now, again, they're hoping that they can just ramrod this thing through. And remember that what they're working against is the waking of the city. They want this done before the city wakes up. There could be a riot. But Pilate won't play along. To everybody's surprise, Pilate says, "That's not good enough. If that's all you got, then you go try him yourself." And it's at this point that the Jewish leadership says, "You know that we can't put him to death," which means that this really isn't a trial, it's a lynching. But they say, "You know we can't put him to death." And at that point, Pilate takes Jesus inside that gate. He walks him inside the praetorium, into Herod's beautiful, vast palace, and there is a private interview between Jesus and Pilate. After that, Pilate comes out, and to everybody's stunned amazement, Pilate announces for the first of 5 times, in the record, 5 times, Pilate says, "I'm not going to crucify him. This man is guiltless." And now, at this time, the city is not awakened. But the accusers are there, the Sanhedrinists, and they begin to cry out, no, the man is a danger to the throne, and he has been a danger to Rome ever since Galilee. That's what they say. He's been stirring up trouble ever since Galilee. Well, when Pilate hears the word Galilee, he thinks to himself quite clearly, wait a minute, that's not my jurisdiction. If this all started in Galilee, then it belongs to Herod Antipas. And guess what? Herod Antipas, who lives up there in Galilee, is in town for the feast. As a matter of fact, all right, stay with me. Who is Herod Antipas' father? Herod the Great. Who built this huge palace? Herod the Great. This is Herod Antipas' boyhood home. Remember, I told you before that Herod the Great actually lived here. So this is his boyhood home. There's a lot of discussion about where would Herod Antipas stay when he was in town. Well, for heaven's sakes, I think he'd stay. I like to say he may have had the same posters on the wall, you know what I'm saying, from when he was growing up. So I think Herod was staying right there. And again, I like to say this because we don't have a lot of time to work with here. So Pilate says to himself, I'm going to send him to Herod. Well, it's probably just inside and across the courtyard. So they haul Jesus into Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas is a dissolute, and he's put John the Baptist to death, and he's afraid that maybe John the Baptist come back from the dead, and he's heard about all these miracles. He's anxious to see one. Through this entire, by the way, before Pilate, before Herod Antipas, before Pilate, Jesus never speaks. He's absolutely silent. So now the accusers, some of the accusers, take Jesus in with the soldiers to Herod Antipas's quarters. They hear all these accusations at him. Herod Antipas just wants to see a miracle. Nothing happens. So he gives up on that, and he's sent back to Pilate. So I say those three stages. First of all, before Pilate, what's the charge? If you weren't a malefactor, we would have brought him to you, then you do it. And that's before Pilate takes him in for a private interview. Then he comes out, the man is innocent. Well, he's been in trouble ever since Galilee. Galilee sends him off to Herod Antipas. He's there for just a few minutes, nothing comes of it. He comes back. While he is waiting, while Pilate's sitting at that bema seat that I showed you in the picture, while Pilate is waiting, he comes up with an idea, and it's a stroke of genius, because he knows that every year the local Roman government, in order to take some of the, because Passover was such a boiling pot, everybody was thinking about sedition. To sort of relieve some of the tension and pressure, they would release a prisoner, and they let the people decide, all right, which of your seditionists, which of your troublemaking prisoners you want us to release? And evidently, they would pretty much decided on Barabbas already. But the point is that as Pilate is sitting there thinking, and the city is waking up. And Pilate remembers Sunday when the whole city welcomed him as king, Jesus, and he remembers Monday when they all applauded as they drove the money changers off the temple and so on. So Pilate has a stroke of genius. I'll go over the Sanhedrinists and I'll put it to the people, because the people are starting to gather. So now they bring him back, and Pilate says to the people, who would you have me give you, Jesus or Barabbas? Now, number one, Pilate is absolutely convinced they're going to say Jesus, because they love Jesus. And number two, he thinks, therefore, I can get out of this sorry mess just by saying, well, I'm sorry, guys, to the Sanhedrin, and I know we had this big plan, but the people just asked for Jesus, and what can I do? But the Bible says that the chief priests, convinced the people to ask for Barabbas. And so Pilate says, who would you have me give you, Barabbas or Jesus? And to his stunned amazement and chagrin, because he thought he was going to get out of this, the people say, give us Barabbas. And remember, Pilate says, what would you have me to do with Jesus, whom you call king, whom you call Messiah, last Sunday? And they say, crucify him. And Pilate works hard, and then Pilate takes another step. And I think this is an act, hold on here now, of horribly cruel kindness. Because Pilate has Jesus taken inside the praetorium, time out. The word for that place where Pilate was staying is the praetorium. It simply is a Roman word that means the residence of the most senior Roman official. So wherever he is, he's on the battlefield, it's tent. If he's at home, it's his palace. If he's visiting Jerusalem, it's Herod's palace. The praetorium is where the senior guy is staying. So they take Jesus in the praetorium, and he is scourged, and he is horribly scourged. Then Pilate brings him back out, puts a cheap robe and a crown of thorns on him, stands him before the people, and says, behold the man. Now what he is saying is, look at the man. You're saying this is a threat to Rome. You're saying that we have to crucify him as a danger to us. Have you had enough? I'm going to scourge him and let him go. But the Jesus accusers, and now the people begin to cry out, no, crucify him. And when they cry out, and by the way, Pilate says for the fifth time, I am going to let him go. He is guiltless. When he says that, they say this, John 19, verse 7. Folks, this is huge. I'm laying a lot on you. This is huge. They say, all right, if you're not going to if you're not going to execute him as a seditionist, we have a law. He needs to die because he makes himself the Son of God. That's why Jesus went to the cross. When Pilate heard that, he was the more afraid, took Jesus in for a second interview, spends time talking to this is the only time Jesus speaks in the entire drama, when he's alone with Pilate, brings him back out, and again says, what the Bible says, he tried the more carefully to release him, but the people said, here's their trump card, if you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Caesar. And he knew that he'd used up all of his coupons back in Rome. I told you before, he was a crippled ruler. And so Pilate washes his hands and turns Jesus over to be crucified. Does that make sense to you? So those are the Romans trials, the specifically before Pilate. I want to go back to it. Okay, take a break, and we'll go back to it afterwards. Thank you.